The Vietnam War began in good faith, by good people with good intentions, but some 2 decades later, it was all over. For the Vietnamese, it was not a war about communism, it was a war for independence, a war for Vietnam. But a combination of American overconfidence, Cold War tensions, and imperialist tendencies the Americans had previously fought so hard against, made the war in Vietnam one of America's darkest pages in its short but dense history. By the end of the war, more than 58,000 Americans would die, as too would 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. Over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas would also perish, as well as over 2 million civilians from both the North and the South, and thousands more from Laos and Cambodia. The French conquest of Indochina began in 1858. They boasted about bringing their civilization to Vietnam, beginning the construction of roads and bridges. But the Vietnamese did not take well to their French colonizers, just as they hadn't to earlier invasions by the Chinese. The French were the enemy, and the Vietnamese people's struggle for independence. In 1919, at the end of the Great War, American President Woodrow Wilson went to Paris to help rebuild a new world, and advocated for the independence of colonized nations. Upon his stay in France, a man appeared with a petition for the president, signed by himself and other Vietnamese nationalists, asking that Vietnam too become an independent state. The president's secretary promised to show it to Wilson, but there is no evidence he ever did. Throughout his career, this man would go by some 70 names, but eventually settle for the most enlightened one, Ho Chi Minh. After taking part in a demonstration against a puppet emperor, Ho Chi Minh was marked for arrest and fled Vietnam in 1911, remaining in exile for 30 years. When he discovered the anti-colonial writings of Lenin, he became a communist. His fuel was for an independent Vietnam. By 1940, the Second World War had come. Germany had conquered most of Western Europe, including France, and the Japanese began to occupy Vietnam. To help fight the Japanese invaders, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam and founded a revolutionary movement, which he named the Vietnam Independence League, the Viet Minh. This new fighting force grew quickly and relied on guerrilla warfare tactics, hit-and-run strategies that would later be used some 3 decades later when the Americans arrived. In the spring of 1945, 3 years after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States government were looking for ways to undermine Japanese forces in Vietnam when they were contacted by Ho Chi Minh. The OSS, the precursors for the CIA, supplied Ho and his guerrilla fighters with weapons and were impressed with how quickly they learned to handle them. Ho began to call his followers the Viet American Army and praised the United States as a champion of democracy. When 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japanese surrender seemed imminent. Ho Chi Minh called upon all the people of Vietnam to rise up and take control of their country before the French could re-establish their rule. On the 2nd of September 1945, the same day as the Japanese surrendered, ending World War II, hundreds of thousands of people went to Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi to see Ho Chi Minh proclaim Vietnam independent. The future looked promising, but President Franklin Roosevelt, who had campaigned for a world of independent self-governing states, was now dead, and his successor, Harry Truman, was facing an entirely different world. The Soviet Union had occupied Eastern Europe and looked to spread further into Turkey, Greece, and Iran. The Cold War had begun. The French warned if their colonies were to become independent under American assistance, France would have no choice but to fall under Soviet influence. The French poured thousands of men back into Vietnam with the help of American aid. In 1950, Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. Domino theory was at the height of political thought, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, others would as well. The United States sent tens of thousands of troops to push the invaders back north. They did so successfully, and it showed Western powers that communism in Asia could be contained. By 1953, with the help of American aid, the French had been fighting for 7 years in Vietnam, and had suffered more than 100,000 casualties. French platoons would be ambushed, trains blown up, roads blocked, all for them to be ambushed again. The Viet Minh supplied by the Soviets and Chinese were a force to be reckoned with. The French were demoralised, and so proposed to begin talks to end the fighting. Before the talks began, however, both sides tried to enforce their military positioning. The French set up a fortified base in Dien Bien Phu, believing any altercation would result in a French victory. So confident, in fact, they saw no need to worry about the jungle-covered hills that overlooked their 11,000 men. 50,000 Vietnamese soldiers then surrounded the valley, and their heavy artillery began to fire. The French were trapped. After 55 days of brutal attack, the French surrendered, having lost 8,000 troops. After 100 years of colonial rule, the French were leaving. This decisive victory for the Viet Minh installed a belief that they could fight a great Western power and win. An armistice was then signed, splitting Vietnam into two parts along the 17th parallel, separated by a demilitarized zone. Civilians had 300 days to relocate to their preferred destination, and so 900,000 refugees fled to the south, seeking a life free from communism. The South would become known as the Republic of Vietnam, with Diem as its president in the capital of Saigon and protected by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN. In the north, the capital would become Hanoi, where Ho Chí Minh and the Communists implemented land reforms, similar to those under Mao, leaving thousands dead and imprisoned. The Viet Cong and their leaders were willing to break the peace, to head south along what would soon be called the Ho Chí Minh Trail and fight for a united Vietnam. These men belonged to an organization called the National Liberation Front, the NLF. The armed wing of the organization was called the People's Liberation Armed Forces, but the US and its allies gave them a more disparaging name: Communist Traitors to the Nation, the Viet Cong. John F. Kennedy had been elected, and Cold War tensions were at new heights. The lessons from the Second World War were on every policymaker's mind. Aggressive dictatorships needed to be stopped before they constituted a serious danger to the peace of the world. A growing number of critics complained at Kennedy's leniency. He had failed to stop the construction of the Berlin Wall, and communism was spreading in Laos and Cambodia. So when time came for Vietnam, he couldn't be seen to do nothing. Kennedy's advisors insisted he should send ground troops into Vietnam to help the South push back the Viet Cong. Vietnam can't fall to communism, he was told, but he refused to send in troops. Instead, he sent an elite group of soldiers, the Green Berets, and military advisors to train and organize South Vietnam's military. Kennedy also took other steps, doubling their military funding, sending helicopters and armoured personnel carriers. But he also authorized the use of napalm, defoliants, and Agent Orange to deny cover to the Viet Cong and to destroy the crops that fed them. But the American build-up of personnel in South Vietnam worried Ho Chí Minh, who saw an invasion of the North as inevitable. The Chinese then promised to arm his troops, and conscription was introduced, requiring every able-bodied man to serve. Corruption and the suppression of Buddhists by Catholic officials in South Vietnam's government had become so bad that to protest President Diem and his regime's oppression, a 73-year-old monk set himself on fire. As a silent crowd watched him burn to death, another monk repeated again and again, "A Buddhist monk becomes a martyr. A Buddhist monk becomes a martyr." Soon other monks would become martyrs, but instead of allowing greater freedoms for his people, President Diem imposed martial law and arrested anyone that protested. The South, a place promised to become a democracy, had become a dictatorship. Diem's reign could not continue. Vietnam's military generals, who had been told a coup would not be stopped by the United States, assassinated Diem and his brother. People took to the streets in celebration, but a new threat had arrived, and one Kennedy had dreaded. Who was to replace him? Kennedy would not live to see the question he had pondered. He was assassinated on the 22nd of November 1963, and his vice president Lyndon B. Johnson was now in charge. Fearing it would make a bad situation worse, Johnson had opposed the coup that overthrew Diem, and it had. With Diem gone, the Viet Cong saw an opportunity and began to carry out attacks throughout the countryside. A new power struggle began in the south. Between January 1964 and June 1965, there would be 8 different governments. Coup after coup left the government in ruins. As the USS Maddox slowly moved through the Gulf, after issuing warning shots, it came under fire from a North Vietnamese torpedo squadron. Ho Chi Minh was shocked to hear of his navy's attack, and the officer on duty was removed for impulsiveness. Ho Chi Minh demanded to know who gave the order to attack, but there are still disagreements to this day on who did. Back in Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff urged retaliation against Vietnam, but Johnson again refused. A second attack would have to happen to justify retaliation, Johnson argued, but no second attack ever did. Instead, sonar operators convinced themselves an attack from the North Vietnamese had probably occurred. The attack was probable but not certain, Johnson was told, and since it had probably happened, it shouldn't be left unanswered. American pilots were sent to attack North Vietnamese torpedo boat installations and oil facilities. For the first time, American pilots dropped bombs on Vietnam. The non-existent second attack allowed Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, granting the president authority to assist any Southeast Asian country threatened by communist aggression, and gave Johnson the legal justification to deploy US forces in Vietnam. In retaliation, North Viet Cong guerrillas shelled the American air base near Saigon, killing 5 Americans and destroying 5 B-57 bombers. Advisors again suggested to Johnson he should place troops on the ground and carry out an air attack on targets in the north, but he refused to send ground troops. The Viet Cong then struck an American helicopter base at Pleiku, killing 8 advisors and wounding hundreds more, and later blowing up a hotel, killing 23 Americans. Hoping to bomb them into surrender, Johnson responded on March 2, 1965, systematically bombarding targets, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. The president had changed his policy from retaliatory bombing to an all-out attack, something that was kept from the public. The American people couldn't know he had widened the war.